So thank you once again for joining us during this Bible study tonight. We will begin as normal with a quiz, so I hope we're all ready for the quiz. Again, this is not a test of conversion or anything like that. It doesn't matter whether you do well or don't do well. It's just a reminder quiz. So let's go straight to the quiz. Last week, if you remember, we discussed Hebrews chapter 9. We came across a Greek word. The Greek word was diatheke, or diatheke, sometimes it's pronounced. It has two possible meanings. They are covenant and what is the other meaning of this Greek word? Question number 2. Christ is the something of a new covenant. This is an 8-letter word beginning with the letter M. Question number 3. The old covenant did not cleanse the what? What's the answer here? A 9-letter word. Question number 4. Christ and his ministry gave substance to Old Testament what? And here we're looking for a word which is in the plural, by the way, and it's 7 letters. Question number 5. A. Something. To God's presence is possible only through Christ. What is this word beginning with A? 6 letters. So let's go straight to the answers, and we can decide how well we've done there. This is the revision quiz answers. Diatheke has 2 possible meanings, covenant and will, as in the phrase last will and testament. And if you remember, the writer of Hebrews takes that second meaning and begins to contrast that second meaning with the other meaning of covenant, and to show that death is required in order for a will to kick in. Question number 2. Christ is and here's the answer, mediator of a new covenant. Question number 3. The old covenant did not cleanse and here's the answer once again, conscience. Question number 4. Christ and his ministry give substance to Old Testament shadows. That's the thought. And question number 5, I don't know why the letter 5 is lit up in red. There we are. But the answer is access. Access to God's presence is possible only through Christ. So I'm sure we all did well in that. Probably most of us have 100%. But if you don't have 100%, please don't feel bad about it. That's fine. So let's continue with the study this evening. Tonight we are going to be talking about Hebrews chapter 10. And I think it's perhaps easier for us to understand what is about to be said and then read the chapter. So I'm going to go through some of the main ideas that we find in Hebrews chapter 10. So, Hebrews chapter 10 details these thoughts. It details how the repetition of Old Testament sacrifices did not cleanse the conscience. We're about to read of that. It will say that no matter how often animal sacrifices were made, the conscience was not cleansed because they had to be made again, and time after time animal sacrifices were repeated. We'll also see how these Old Testament sacrifices were temporary. They were limited in time and in scope. Again, we will see how the coming and the sacrifice of Christ fulfills God's will. Christ was sent, and that fulfilled his will, and also he had a one-time, or if you wish, a one-off sacrifice on our behalf, and that is because he was fulfilling the will of God. We will also see in Hebrews chapter 10 that we are now the recipients of the new covenant. We are the people of the new covenant. In addition, we will see that Christ, having made the perfect sacrifice for us, is now at the right hand of God. And these thoughts are repeated in different ways as we go through chapter 10. Some other things are also relevant in chapter 10. We'll see how prophecy pointed to how Jesus would be sacrificed, should have missing D there, I said that wrong. Prophecy pointed to how Jesus would be sacrificed on our behalf, and through his sacrifice, our sins would be forgiven and forgotten. Not just forgiven, but also forgotten. Hebrews chapter 10 also details how, through Christ, we are cleansed from the defilement of sin. And also, we'll read how through the one-off sacrifice of Christ, who is our high priest, we have the full assurance of access to God. So we can already see that in Hebrews chapter 10, there is a lot of information. But that's not the end of it. There are other thoughts in Hebrews chapter 10. It's a long chapter. We will see how we should not neglect the assembling of ourselves together. Also we'll see how it is possible for believers to reject Christ through willful sinning. A rather sobering thought, but it is mentioned in Hebrews chapter 10. We'll see how judgment awaits for those who thus reject Christ. There is a day of judgment. We'll also see how the Spirit is the Spirit of grace. There's a beautiful section which we will read. In fact, it's a section which is beautiful in one way, but also it's a warning. But in it, the Spirit is described as the Spirit of grace. Also, we'll see how it's possible to profane the blood of the new covenant. What does that mean? Well, that will be discussed as we go through Hebrews chapter 10. Not finished yet. There's more that we'll read. Again, it's a long chapter. We'll see how the intended readers of Hebrews went through persecution and trials and had some of their property taken away from them because of their faith. And we'll also see how the people who would read the book of Hebrews, and also us now, today, how we and they have a better and abiding possession. Again, this word better covenant, better sacrifice, and now another thought, better possession. And we'll also see how believers are the people of faith. Some other things will become relevant in the book of Hebrews. I want to note a couple of ideas that we will read. Because in Hebrews chapter 10, there are some direct and indirect commands that are relevant to us. So far in the book of Hebrews, there's been quite a lot of doctrine explained. And we have gone through that, I hope, fairly methodically. But now we will see that as we go into the last few chapters, there are some commands and some recommendations and some things that the writer of Hebrews tells us not to do. So let's consider what some of those will be as we go through chapter 10. A command is that we draw near to God with a true heart. That will come up in one particular section. Also, we're told that we should hold fast the confession of faith and consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. So that's a number of ideas of which we've read already. And also, of course, we're told that we should not be involved in neglecting to meet. We should meet with one another and also encourage one another. And a command is also to recall the former days when you were enlightened, the hour, if you wish, when we first believed. Think about that and let thoughts about that rekindle our faith. Some other direct and indirect commands. We're told that we should not spurn the Son of God. Don't speak ill of him. Don't trample the Son of God underfoot. You'll see what that means as we go through Hebrews 10. We're also told not to grieve the Spirit of grace. Also, do not throw away your confidence of faith. Therefore, you'll see the writer concludes with some of these thoughts. Therefore, let us endure. Don't shrink back away from your faith, but rather have faith and preserve your soul. So those are a number of direct and indirect commands that we'll see in Hebrews chapter 10. And in one way, the tone begins to change in Hebrews 10, where there is more direct information about a change of covenant implies a change of law, and of course that also implies a change of obedience. And it's beginning to go in to some of those ideas about obedience. One other thing we will see as we read Hebrews chapter 10 is that the writer relies a lot on the book of Psalms. The writer will refer to Psalm 110. We have been there already, if you remember, where it discusses how Christ is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. But another psalm that is expounded in Hebrews is Psalm 40, verses 6 to 8. I want to read that psalm prior to reading Hebrews chapter 10. It says, "In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted." This is quite a change in thinking. Let's remember that as we read or have read the Old Testament, that what happens is there is gradually a progression in understanding. There's a progression in revelation concerning who God is and what God does for us. Some would have thought by reading parts of Leviticus and parts of Deuteronomy and parts of Exodus that perhaps God did delight in sacrifice and offering. But here David begins to expound a different view, and this will be picked up in Hebrews 10. It says, "In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, Behold, I have come, and in the scroll of the book it is written of me, I will delight to do your will, O my God, for your law is within my heart." Remember we read in Jeremiah talking about how the law is written into the hearts of the worshippers of the true God. And that will again be referred to in Hebrews chapter 10. So we've set a concept now of where we are going. And so come with me now and we'll begin to read Hebrews chapter 10 together. I'm reading throughout from the English Standard Version. "For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, Remember, this has been discussed throughout. The Levitical priesthood was just a shadow of the true priesthood of Christ. The high priest and the services surrounding the high priest on the Day of Atonement, they are but shadows of the reality of the substance that Jesus is. So, again, the writer is talking about these things. And it then says, it, meaning the law, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. This is explaining the ineffectiveness of the sacrificial system that was instituted in Exodus and in Leviticus when it comes to the idea of making people perfect. That did not happen. The sacrificial system of the Old Testament was imperfect, inadequate. It did not cleanse the conscience of the worshipper. Whereas the sacrifice of Jesus Christ is different. It goes on to say, it's again Hebrews 10, now verse 2, I think. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, had it been true that the sacrifices made people perfect in some way, cleanse their consciences? Then there would have been no need to continue to offer sacrifices. So otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins? So this was the failure, if you wish, of the sacrificial system. It did not cleanse the consciousness or cleanse the conscience. It did not make us perfect. It did not begin to develop us into a stronger and more spiritual being. It did not help us to grow into the image of God, which of course the sacrifice of Jesus Christ does do. So let's continue now with Hebrews 10. We're now going to go to verse 3. It says, but in these sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year, because they continued at such length, year after year after year. People were reminded of their sins of commission, their sins of omission, and the sins that they did without realizing they were doing, which were accounted for, if you remember, on the Day of Atonement. He says, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. So all those animals, the goats that were sacrificed, if you remember, on the Day of Atonement, the sheep also that were sacrificed, the bulls, none of those things took away sin. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, and remember in Hebrews chapter 1, there is a lot of discussion about how Christ came into the world, and he is God's only begotten Son. The incarnation, again here, is implied. So consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired. This is going back to Psalm 40 that we read a few moments ago. Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired. This isn't God's will. He's not delighted in the death of all those creatures. But a body you have prepared for me. So the writer is embracing that passage in Psalm 40 and applying it to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And Christ, of course, is the body. When Christ came into the world, a body was prepared to be sacrificed for us. It goes on to say, quoting from the same psalm, in burnt offerings and sin offerings you take no pleasure. Very clear indication that God is not delighted by burnt offerings and sin offerings. People may have thought that God was delighted by those things. But here, the writer of the book of Hebrews is quoting the psalm to force home his point that all those sacrifices were to no effect when it comes to the idea of removing sin. They may have demonstrated a kind of loyalty, they may have demonstrated a kind of faith, but they did not remove sin. Of course, David also explains that the true sacrifice is a contrite heart. Remember, that is also in the Psalms, but it isn't referred to here. Then, again quoting from that particular passage, Psalm 40, "Then I said, Behold, I have come to do your will," applying this to Jesus and to his ministry. Remember, Christ said in the Garden of Gethsemane, he said to the Father, "Father, not my will, but your will be done." And this he said for our sake. And also he said that to set an example to us, that we may say the same thing. So, "Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book," referring back to that passage. And when he said above, "You have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings," and remember we read somewhat about sin offerings before, and all those things are offered according to the law. Remember we discussed the idea of what the law was and what the old covenant was, and how the law itself did not deal with transgressions of the law. And so the sacrificial system was introduced in a way to attend to the issue of transgressions. But really, they did not deal with them. Christ is the one that deals with transgressions, and Christ is the one that deals with sin. So these are offered according to the law. Then he added, "Behold, I have come to do your will," re-stressing this thought. And then a very remarkable verse. What is written here? He, talking of Jesus Christ, talking about the Word, talking about the Son of God, and of course talking about God himself. He does away with the first in order to establish the second. This is talking about the covenant idea. Remember the idea of this word, diatheke, meaning covenant, or meaning the last will and testament. And how we read last week that the old covenant is passing away, the writer said. The old covenant has been abolished, and you do away with the first in order to establish the second. And this is true both of a covenant, an agreement, and also of a last will and testament. If you write a new will, in writing that new will, you do away with the first. You overwrite the first. Of course, it's important to remember that when we think of the idea of a new covenant, the new covenant is not an update of the old. It is entirely new. Of course, sometimes if we have a will, we might write in some old features from the old will into a new will, but it's still a new will. It's not updated in that sense. And so it is that idea with covenants as well. The new covenant is new. Important to remember that thought. And so he does away with the first, talking of the old covenant, in order to establish the second. Let's continue now, remembering the thoughts that we discussed beforehand. And by that will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Remember, we read that a body would be provided. We read this idea of this new will, or this new covenant. Through that, we are sanctified, made holy, through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. He was not like the succession of high priests who would make offerings on atonement every year for a number of consecutive years. He was not like the priests who would make the daily offerings or the weekly offerings. Christ made an offering once for all. And every priest stands daily at his service. Here's a contrast here between the old system and the new system. And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. That's referring to Psalm 110. Now, Hebrews 10 verse 14. You see a reference to Jeremiah 31 in a moment. It says, "For by a single offering, this offering that Christ does once for all, he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified." This is talking about you and me. It's talking about us. We are in the process of sanctification, being made separate, being made holy for God's purpose, growing into the image of his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, who is the only image of God. And the Holy Spirit also bears witness to us. For after saying, "This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days," referring to Jeremiah, declares the Lord, "I will put my laws on their hearts and write them on their minds." And then he adds, "I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more." Forgiveness is there, but also the idea of forgetting our sin. Two aspects of atonement. And where there is forgiveness of these, there is no longer any offering for sin. We don't need the repeated offering that the Old Testament sacrificial system implied. Let's continue. Hebrews 10 verse 19. "Therefore, brothers and sisters," remember that word in the Greek, adelphi is the word, refers really to siblings. Siblings is a better translation. Brothers and sisters. "Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus," talking about the Holy of Holies. Remember, at the time of his crucifixion, the veil was torn in two. We are now able to enter through Christ into the presence of the Father. To enter the holy places by the blood of Christ, by the new and living way, this is Jesus, that he opened for us through the curtain. Remember again, the curtain was torn in two. That is, through his flesh. "And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart." One of these thoughts. Let's draw near. One of these commands, if you wish, instructions. Let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. That's the thought here. This is what Jesus has done for us. We have access to God the Father, to the throne of grace, as it is described in Hebrews 4 and verse 16, if you remember. We have access to that throne of grace through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Let's continue. Hebrews 10, 23 and 25, or 2:25. So, again, an admonition, an encouragement to do something. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, because we have this person who is faithful to us. For he who promised is faithful. Jesus is the faithful one, and through him we have better promises. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some. Now, I know we haven't really met together during this coronavirus crisis. Maybe sometimes we've been able to meet, but not as often as we would like. But we still are together in this kind of setting and through Zoom meetings. And whenever it becomes possible to meet physically again, let's do that. Let's come together. Don't neglect that. Then he says, as is a habit of some. So clearly, some of his readers had decided to make the practice of attending church more optional than was necessary. They make excuses as to why they shouldn't go to church. Let's not be like that. But rather, let's encourage one another. And all the more as we see the day drawing near. Meaning, remember how it was discussed at the end of chapter 9, that Christ is coming a second time to save. This is what is being referred to here, his second coming. Let's encourage one another, and all the more as we see the day drawing near. And of course we don't know when that day is, but I for one hope it is very near. And I think every generation of Christians have lived in hopeful expectation of Christ's return. We too should do that. Let's continue. Hebrews 10 verses 26 to 28. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth. Now, why would we do that? I guess we succumb to temptation. I guess we get too much involved in our own ideas and our own thoughts. Or maybe we think too much about ourselves. I don't know why we would do it, but there can be many contributing factors. So if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin. What are we going to try and do? Are we going to somehow want Christ to be crucified again? Is that what we want? Well, of course not. But rather, there does remain a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Frightening thought, isn't it? And anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Here he's about to make another contrast. He's saying, remember what happened under the old law? How people would die without mercy when 2 or 3 people would accuse them of sinning and it was proven in some way, and there'd be no mercy and they would be put to death. Contrast that idea. How much more of a problem is it if we decide to deliberately sin after receiving the knowledge of the truth? And so he says in the next verse 29, how much worse punishment, making this contrast between the law of Moses and now the new covenant. How much worse punishment, do you think, will be deserved by the one who has spurned the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified? Another translation says that what about the person who tramples the Son of God underfoot, who doesn't care about the mention of Jesus Christ? Sometimes I've been accused of talking about Jesus Christ too often. I'm sorry, I don't apologize for that. Christ is my Lord. Christ is my Saviour. I want to proclaim his name whenever I can. We can't talk about Christ too often. And yet some people would say, don't listen to all the talk about Jesus Christ. Is that spurning the Son of God? Is that profaning the blood of the covenant by which we have been sanctified? And does it outrage the Spirit of grace? What a frightening thought, isn't it, in some ways? Thankfully, of course, the Spirit is the Spirit of grace. And note here, the Spirit can be grieved if you wish. The Spirit can be outraged. The Spirit is not just some objective thing. This is a concept to do with feelings in regard to the Spirit of grace. For we know him who said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." Of course, this is quoted in Romans 12, if you remember. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. A warning is preached. And of course, through the ages, it's also preached to us. Don't neglect our salvation. Don't spurn the Son of God. Don't profane the blood of the covenant by which we have been sanctified. And don't outrage the Spirit of grace. Let's continue. Hebrews 10:32. But rather, let's recall the former times, after you were enlightened. Remember the hour you first believed. Recapture that zeal. Remember when you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. Perhaps this is referring to some of the marriages that were there with his readers when there was one partner who was not yet a Christian, and they saw the husband or the wife in some way persecuted for faith. For you had compassion, it says, on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property. They had gone through some kind of persecution, and the writer of Hebrews is familiar with what they went through, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. And of course we belong to Jesus, don't we? We are like his possession, if you wish. We have a better future. We don't live for this world. We live for the world to come, because we are people of faith. Verse 35. Therefore, don't throw away your confidence. You had it once. Remember, don't throw it away now, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. Again, this thought about God's will. Jesus fulfilled God's will. We fulfill God's will. Let's continue. Verse 37 now. Hebrews 10, the last couple of verses. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. In one instance, that's talking about us, but let's remember that Jesus is the only righteous one. And we are righteous only to the degree that we participate in Jesus. Jesus is our righteous one. But my righteous one shall live by faith. Talking again of us as we live in Christ. But if he or she shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him or in her. So again the thought, don't shrink back. And then what the writer of Hebrews is about to do is to give us example after the example of people of faith. You probably know that already. So he says in the last verse there, but we are not of those who shrink back. This is not who we are. And I think as I talk to all of you, all of us tonight, I don't think we are of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but rather we are of those who have faith and preserve their souls. And then the writer goes into Hebrews chapter 11. I'm sure we remember Hebrews chapter 11, and that's what we will study next week, Hebrews 11. So thank you for listening to me tonight. Don't forget that we have various Zoom services over the weekend, and we have the national stream at 11 a.m. this coming Sunday, and we'll look into Hebrews 11 a week today on Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. So thank you for listening, and I wish you good night. Please take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye for now.